Hello, my dear friends. Victorian women could go months without a single bath, and most people around them saw nothing strange in it. Their choices were shaped by cold rooms, dangerous water, strict beliefs, and silent rules that governed every corner of daily life. What looked like neglect from the outside was, in truth, a careful system built from fear, scarcity, and expectation. Tonight, we step quietly into that world to see why bathing became the rarest act of all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone wandered through a modest Victorian home at the break of day, they would find a small pot sitting on the iron stove, its thin trail of steam rising like a fragile promise, rather than a guarantee of warmth. The water inside would barely cover the bottom, slowly heating only because the family had scraped together the last bits of coal from a bucket that always seemed close to empty. For many households, obtaining warm water was less a simple task and more a constant negotiation with time, weather, and resources that rarely stretch far enough. Fuel costs money, and fire demanded attention, so every moment spent coaxing a pot to simmer meant another moment stolen from work that determined whether a family could keep a roof overhead. Victorian women understood this reality too well, standing before stoves that never seemed hot enough, watching the fire shrink, knowing that the water they needed for washing their bodies was slipping away as quickly as the heat that tried to warm it. Even on days when they patiently waited, stirring and checking the water, the cold air of the house pressed in on them, stealing heat faster than the stove could offer it back. In many cramped dwellings, warm water never existed in any meaningful quantity. Families lacked deep basins or sturdy tubs that could hold enough water for a proper bath, so the idea of soaking in warmth as a way to cleanse the body was not only impractical, but unthinkable. A handful of tin pails, dented and thin, served every need from cleaning dishes to soaking laundry, and a woman knew that dedicating precious water to her own comfort was a luxury she could not justify. This scarcity created a rhythm of daily life where cleanliness depended not on desire but on mathematics, on calculating how much warmth could survive against the cold that seeped through walls and floorboards. Even those who dared to attempt a fuller wash faced a discouraging reality. Water that left the stove hot quickly turned lukewarm as it was carried across the room, then cooled further the moment it met the air. The few minutes of warmth that remained were often gone before a woman could even begin washing her arms, leaving her shivering in a chill that bit into her bones. Winter deepened this hardship until it became a quiet cruelty. Houses rarely held heat well, and the simplest breeze slipping through a window frame could undo an hour of carefully tended fire. Women found themselves caught in a contradiction where bathing required warmth, yet warmth was the very thing their homes could not keep. A basin filled with even slightly warmed water might turn cold the instant it touched the metal sides of the tin or the coarse fabric of a washcloth. Fingers stiffened, breath shortened, and the idea of washing more than a small patch of skin felt like a punishment rather than relief. In households where children, elders, and laundry already demanded endless labour, few women were willing to endure the discomfort of stripping down in a room colder than the streets outside. The body recoiled at the shock, and the mind understood that getting warm again would cost more time and more fuel than the family could spare. For poorer families, the preparation of warm water meant sacrificing other needs. A morning fire might be saved for cooking porridge or boiling linens, not for a woman who simply wished to feel clean. The choice was never between comfort and inconvenience, but between survival and something far less significant. The weight of these decisions shaped the routines of women who learned to live with cold skin and layers of clothing that hid the absence of warmth beneath. In such conditions, bathing became a distant ideal, an activity reserved for those who lived in homes with better stoves, stronger walls, and enough coal to burn without worry. Victorian women did not refuse to bathe out of neglect, but out of an environment that carved away every opportunity to feel warm enough to attempt it. Even in moments when a woman gathered enough water to attempt a wash, the experience itself reinforced the futility. The steam vanished first, then the comfort, leaving behind only the awareness of how quickly the world reclaimed what little warmth she had created. The noise of wind rattling windows reminded her that cold was waiting to settle on her skin again the moment she stopped. Warm water was a brief visitor in a household that never welcomed it for long. To bathe under such conditions felt like asking for illness rather than cleanliness, and every story of a neighbour who grew sick after bathing in winter added to the quiet fear that circulated among women. They trusted their instincts, which told them that staying clothed and dry was safer than chasing temporary warmth that disappeared as quickly as hope. Over time, this scarcity shaped a culture where bathing was viewed not as a routine but as an anomaly, an act that required more resources than most families could spare. Warm water was a privilege, not a guarantee, and its absence influenced every aspect of hygiene and daily life. Victorian women learned to adapt through necessity, choosing methods that kept them functional rather than comfortable, and in doing so accepted a world where warmth belonged to those who could afford to waste it. In households battling the cold each day, the simple act of heating water carried a weight that shaped choices far beyond the basin. The struggle to obtain warm water reveals how bathing became a rare event, shaped by cold rooms and limited fuel. The daily compromises women made around heat opened the door to larger patterns of avoidance. Something else in their homes and communities deepened this reluctance in ways even warmth could not overcome. The water available to most Victorian households carried a heaviness that could be seen even before it touched the skin. In crowded neighbourhoods where homes leaned into one another and narrow alleys funneled waste toward the lowest ground, wells stood as the only source of daily water, yet they drew from soil permeated by refuse rather than purity. Every bucket pulled up from these dark shafts revealed more than water. Flecks of grit floated across the surface, strands of hay drifted beneath, and the faintest tint of yellow or brown hinted at what lay upstream. Households gathered around these wells every morning because they had no other choice, lowering their pails past layers of contamination created by animals, overflowing privies, and heaps of rubbish that soaked into the earth. Victorian women carrying these heavy buckets back home often looked into them with a quiet resignation, already knowing that the water inside would never be clean enough to bathe in. Even when boiled, the smell lingered, and the film that clung to the sides of the pot testified to everything the fire had failed to burn away. Rivers offered no better salvation. Flowing through the heart of industrial towns, they absorbed everything the factories expelled and everything households discarded. The surface shimmered with an oily sheen that fractured the light into dull, broken colours. Tangles of waste drifted along the banks, and the scent rising from the water carried a sourness that clung to the air long after someone walked past. Women couldn't imagine stepping into such water or pouring it over their bodies. The very thought of the river touching bare skin felt like an invitation to sickness. Barges and carts lined the edges of the waterway, their loads of coal, leather scraps, and manure tumbling into the current as workers moved without concern for what it became. The river received all of it and carried it deeper into the city, where families still collected buckets, hoping that distance alone could purify what industry and neglect had tainted. Victorian women understood that the water they brought home was not simply unclean, but dangerous, a quiet threat that lived in every drop, inside their homes. This water revealed its limitations quickly. A basin filled with river water gave off a faint odour that deepened as it warmed on the stove, and the surface developed a thin cloudiness that made it impossible to see the bottom. Even if a woman ignored the scent and the murky hue, she could not ignore what remained on her skin after washing. Films of fine particles settled into the folds of the body, leaving behind a texture that felt more like residue than cleansing. For those who attempted to bathe with such water, the experience often ended in frustration or illness. Small cuts became inflamed, rashes spread beneath clothing. Children who washed their faces before bed woke with eyes irritated by unseen contaminants. Women learned quickly that the water offered no relief from grime, but simply replaced one kind of dirt with another. The irony was bitter. The very substance meant to cleanse them carried the seeds of sickness. In poorer districts, the scarcity of clean water deepened this cycle. Wells located near privies absorbed waste directly, and even water that looked clear could harbour dangers that eyes could not detect. Families crowded into narrow houses shared the same sources, adding to the contamination every time buckets splashed on the ground or wastewater drained into the soil. Victorian women compensated by limiting their contact with water altogether, believing that avoiding it was safer than risking exposure to what it carried. Washing became a symbolic act rather than a physical one. They wiped their faces with damp cloths, brushed off dust from their clothing, and hoped these gestures could substitute for true cleanliness. The household became a place where water was rationed not only out of economic necessity but out of fear. Some reformers attempted to warn communities about the dangers of polluted water, but their voices struggled to rise above the daily noise of survival. Industrial expansion offered employment, yet destroyed the purity of natural resources. To question the safety of water meant questioning the foundations of Victorian progress itself. Women bore the consequences in their own bodies. They lived with the knowledge that the water surrounding them, the water flowing through their town, the water rising in their own wells, was never truly safe. Clean water became a luxury reserved for the wealthy, those whose homes were set higher on the landscape, away from waste, away from factories, away from the sewage that seeped into the ground. These households could boil water that actually smelled clean, could bathe without fear, and could enjoy a level of hygiene impossible for most families. Even then, Victorian society clung to the illusion that access to water was universal. Municipal authorities boasted about pipes and pumps while ignoring the neighbourhoods where contamination was the only constant. The divide widened as the poor accepted their conditions as unchangeable. Victorian women carried buckets through mud that had been soaked in filth, brought them home, and used the water sparingly because they saw no alternative. Each decision reinforced another. Bathing became an indulgence few could justify. Cleanliness became an expectation reserved for those who lived beyond the reach of polluted wells and poisoned rivers. The desire for hygiene faded beneath the weight of daily struggle. As water grew more unreliable, a quiet logic spread through these communities. Why bathe in water that made the body feel worse afterward? Why risk rashes, fever, or infection, simply for the sake of a ritual that brought no comfort and carried so much danger? This logic became woven into Victorian life, accepted without question. Mothers taught their daughters to avoid the river, to distrust the well, to wash only when necessary. These habits were not rooted in ignorance, but in survival. Women lived within a world where filth moved through every layer of the city, from the streets to the soil to the water itself, leaving no space for true cleanliness to take hold. The absence of clean water shaped a world where bathing felt more threatening than neglecting it. The choices families made around these sources carried consequences far beyond simple discomfort. Another force within Victorian society added its own layer of hesitation, turning avoidance into a practice that seemed almost reasonable. Medical authority in Victorian life carried a weight that few dared to challenge, and within that world, water itself was often spoken of as if it were a subtle adversary rather than a source of cleansing. Doctors who moved through the narrow streets with their leather bags and solemn manner encouraged ideas that threaded through households with quiet persistence. They believed the body possessed a delicate internal balance, one that could be disrupted by contact with water that seemed harmless on the surface yet held the power to weaken the constitution. Many physicians spoke of the body as if it were a fragile vessel whose strength leaked away when exposed to moisture, and these warnings settled into the minds of women who were already wary of the risks surrounding them. Houses with cold floors and drafty windows felt hostile enough, but the thought that bathing could erode vitality turned the simple act into a threat that lingered in the background of daily routines. Within the medical texts and informal conversations that shaped public understanding, the opening of pores became a point of obsession. Doctors argued that warm water coaxed the skin to relax, leaving tiny openings through which invisible agents of illness could slip without resistance. For women caring for children, elders, and themselves in environments where disease was common, this explanation felt plausible. They lived among fevers that rose without warning, coughs that echoed through rooms, and infections that spread faster than they could prevent. When physicians insisted that bathing allowed sickness to find its way into the body, households accepted the warning as practical wisdom rather than superstition. A body kept dry and covered was a body protected. A woman who avoided full immersion or prolonged washing was not neglecting cleanliness, but guarding her health in the only way she believed possible. The influence of these ideas grew stronger as they intertwined with the uncertainties of Victorian urban life. Streets were crowded, homes were small, and illnesses circulated freely. Each winter brought waves of respiratory infections that shaped the fears of families, and in this environment, a doctor's advice to limit exposure to water felt like sound strategy. Many women internalized the notion that bathing could drain the strength they needed for labor, childcare, and household management. Fatigue was a constant companion, yet instead of questioning overwork or malnutrition, they learned to see the problem through the lens medical authorities provided. If weakness followed a rare bath, it confirmed the warnings they had heard. If someone fell ill shortly after washing, the explanation felt predetermined. Coincidence became evidence. The medical profession itself was far from unified, yet the loudest voices often carried the most alarming theories. Some doctors claimed that bathing shocked the system, that the sudden shift from warmth to exposure disrupted blood flow and left organs vulnerable. Others warned that too much cleanliness stripped away essential natural oils that protected the body. These explanations were presented with confidence, even when they lacked foundation. In an age before reliable scientific testing or consistent training, much of medical practice relied on tradition, conjecture, and personal belief. Victorian women, taught to view physicians as figures of authority, had little reason to doubt them. Their prescriptions shaped behavior not through force, but through trust. This medical caution shaped the social expectations surrounding women's hygiene. A woman who bathed infrequently was not seen as negligent, but as sensible. She was believed to be preserving her strength and guarding herself against the unseen forces that lurked in the environment. A mother who discouraged her daughter from washing too often was considered prudent. A wife who avoided a full bath before a cold front passed was acting responsibly. These attitudes forged a culture where cleanliness was redefined not by bodily purity, but by perceived safety. Even when women felt the discomfort of sweat or dust accumulating beneath layers of fabric, they hesitated. The fear of inviting illness outweighed the desire for refreshment. In working-class households, where sickness often meant the loss of income or the collapse of family stability, the warnings held even greater power. A single day of fever could prevent a mother from completing essential tasks. A week of illness could plunge a household into deeper hardship. Under such pressures, bathing became a calculated risk that many chose not to take. The cold water available to them only reinforced the danger. If warm water could open pores and weaken the body, then cold water was seen as even more destabilizing. It chilled the skin, tightened the chest, and left the body vulnerable to drafts already feared in everyday life. Doctors had warned that bathing was not necessary for health, and could indeed harm it, so avoiding it required no justification beyond common sense. Even among wealthier families, where better living conditions offered more comfort, medical caution persisted. ladies of higher social status listened to physicians who spoke of bodily delicacy and the importance of maintaining internal equilibrium. They followed regimens meant to preserve composure, vitality, and refinement. Overly frequent bathing was framed as indulgent, excessive, even irresponsible. Women who adhered to these guidelines were praised for their restraint. The cultural power of these ideas created a shared understanding across classes that bathing too often carried risks best avoided. The consequences of these beliefs shaped not only individual habits, but the rhythm of Victorian domestic life. Water was used sparingly. Washing focused on visible areas rather than the whole body. Cloths dipped in minimally warmed water replaced full immersion. The idea of routine bathing, common in later eras, felt alien in a society guided by warnings that framed water as a silent threat. Victorian women lived with a constant balancing act, navigating the tension between physical discomfort and the desire to protect their health. Their caution was not rooted in ignorance, but in the medical frameworks presented to them, frameworks that shaped their decisions as surely as any practical concern. As years passed, these beliefs hardened into norms that seemed too embedded to question. Stories of illness following baths circulated quietly, gaining significance with each retelling. Doctors reinforced them, newspapers hinted at them, and households lived by them. The avoidance of bathing became an accepted form of self-preservation. Victorian women learned to see water not as a pathway to cleanliness, but as a potential danger waiting for a moment of weakness. The warnings of Victorian doctors turned simple hygiene into a matter of protecting one's strength. Their influence reached into households and shaped habits that persisted far beyond medical logic. Something else deepened this reluctance by transforming bathing into an ordeal that extended far beyond fear of illness. Layers of fabric shaped Victorian womanhood long before a single word was spoken about propriety or modesty. These garments created a world that moved with slow difficulty, a world where the simple act of dressing and undressing carried its own weight. Inside cramped rooms lit by small windows or wavering lamplight, women confronted the quiet battle of managing clothing designed less for comfort than for structure. Heavy skirts hung from the waist, petticoats brushed against ankles, and stiff corsets pressed the torso into a narrow silhouette. Every layer served a purpose in public life, yet in private moments, these same layers stood as solid barriers between a woman and any hope of bathing with ease. Each garment had to be loosened, unhooked, lifted, or pulled away, and Victorian women performed this sequence day after day with a patience shaped more by necessity than by choice. In homes without servants, a woman worked through this process alone. Fingers nipped by cold air struggled to find ties hidden beneath folds of cloth. Hooks tugged at seams, refusing to release their hold. A single misaligned fastening could delay her progress, and garments that had twisted throughout the day resisted any attempt to remove them smoothly. The effort required to undo one layer became amplified by the presence of many. In these moments, bathing did not feel like an opportunity for relief, but an obstacle course. Any warmth she had gathered from heating water slipped away as she worked to shed the weight of her clothing. The cold pressed against her skin with increasing insistence, making the process feel more like preparation for hardship than preparation for cleansing. Once the outer garments were removed, the reality of managing the remaining layers became a trial of endurance. Thick underskirts clung to the legs, trapping air that had warmed only slightly during the day. As each layer fell to the floor, the room felt larger, colder, and more unwelcoming. Women moved through this ritual knowing that bathing would require not only undressing but redressing, an effort that demanded equal time and strength. Washing meant confronting the entire process twice, and the thought weighed heavily on women already exhausted by domestic labour. The necessity of managing fabric shaped the rhythm of their decisions. If undressing felt burdensome, then avoiding the bath became a natural conclusion. Fabric itself added to the challenge. Woven from materials meant to maintain form, Victorian garments trapped odours and dust from the outside world, smoke from stoves, dirt from streets, and the faint scent of sweat settled into the fibres. Yet washing these garments required more labour than washing the body. Fabrics grew heavy when wet and dried slowly in cold or damp rooms. Stains clung stubbornly to the surface, and frequent washing threatened to damage the structure of the garments. Women, therefore, found themselves in a constant compromise. Clothing that absorbed dirt and odour discouraged bathing, because wearing clean skin beneath layers that felt unclean created a discomfort that lingered throughout the day. The logic became inverted. Clothing dictated cleanliness rather than the reverse. Even for women with assistance or higher social standing, the burden persisted in different forms. Servants helped remove the elaborate layers, but this required time and privacy. Two things not always available in homes governed by strict routines. The ceremony of dressing and undressing reinforced the social expectation that bathing should occur infrequently. A woman accustomed to having garments arranged for her learned to accept that removing them was an event in itself, not something undertaken lightly. Corsets shaped her posture, skirts shaped her movement, and together they shaped her habits. The more elaborate the attire, the less practical bathing became. Each garment became a reminder that maintaining appearance mattered more than maintaining ease. The rooms in which women attempted to bathe rarely offered comfort. Floors absorbed cold, mirrors fogged easily, and the air chilled the moment clothing was removed. The time needed to shed layers guaranteed exposure to these unpleasant conditions. A woman would step into the space where she intended to wash, already half chilled, and the water she had worked to warm quickly lost its heat as it waited. If she hesitated at any point in the process, the room grew colder still. Winter intensified every step, making the layers she had just removed feel like armour she should not have abandoned. Many women found themselves pausing at this threshold, weighing the discomfort of bathing against the comfort of staying dressed. More often than not, the clothing won. Redressing after a bath became its own ordeal. Damp skin made the fabric cling in the wrong places. Stiff corsets resisted being fastened. Skirts required careful arrangement so they would fall correctly once the day began again. Women felt the pressure of time as they struggled to restore their layered identity. They had responsibilities to attend to, children calling from other rooms, meals waiting to be prepared, and the weight of their garments reminded them of these obligations with every fold. What should have been a moment of refreshment turned into a sequence of tasks that demanded physical and mental effort. Bathing did not simplify life, it complicated it. Through these daily interactions with fabric, Victorian women learned that their clothing shaped their sense of possibility. Layers restricted movement, restricted warmth, and restricted the very idea of ease. Bathing became something to postpone rather than pursue, an interruption to routines that clothing had already defined. Women navigated their days with the quiet understanding that garments both protected and confined them. Removing these layers felt like stepping outside the identity society expected them to maintain, and the struggle to return to that identity made bathing feel impractical even before water entered the equation. The result was a pattern that reinforced itself. Clothing discouraged bathing, and infrequent bathing made garments seem even more necessary to conceal the realities of daily life. The weight of fabric wrapped around the body became both shield and burden, shaping habits that persisted across generations. The cumbersome layers of Victorian dress turned bathing into a task that drained more energy than it restored. The garments women wore shaped their choices long before water touched the basin. A quieter influence woven into everyday life pulled them further from the habit of bathing, hinting at concerns that stretched beyond clothing. Victorian streets carried a blend of smells that settled into daily life so completely that few people questioned their presence. In crowded neighbourhoods where coal smoke drifted from chimneys, where horses left their traces along every road, and where refuse accumulated near back doors, the air itself pressed a mixture of scents against the skin. Women walked through these environments wrapped in layers of fabric that absorbed everything around them, Yet the lingering odours that clung to their clothing or bodies rarely drew comment. Within households shaped by scarcity and long hours of labour, the idea of personal scent existed within a different framework than the one known today. Cleanliness was not defined by fragrance, and bodily odour was not seen as a moral failing or even a notable discomfort. It was simply part of the world, a companion to the work and weariness that filled each day. Soap remained a luxury item for many families, especially those living on narrow wages. Scented soaps carved into delicate shapes or infused with floral oils were sold behind glass in shops that most women entered, only to look rather than to buy. The cost made them unattainable except for special occasions. Even the cheaper varieties offered little relief, as they were harsh to the skin and carried only the faintest traces of fragrance that disappeared moments after washing. For women who managed households on limited means, purchasing such soap would have meant sacrificing food or other necessities. They relied instead on washing with water alone or using coarse soap that stripped the skin without removing odour entirely. In homes where dozens of other concerns competed for attention, the idea of smelling clean was overshadowed by the need to simply stay functional. Cultural norms further reinforced this acceptance. Victorian society placed more emphasis on modesty, restraint, and outward decorum than on maintaining a perfumed presence. The standards that governed dress, posture, and behaviour rarely extended to expectations regarding scent. Women lived in environments where smoke, dust, and sweat were constant, and they understood that no one could escape these conditions entirely. Instead of striving for impossible purity, they adjusted their expectations. When everyone shared similar surroundings and similar sources of odour, the distinctions between one person's scent and another's faded. The notion that bodily odour required immediate correction had not yet taken root. A woman might notice the earthiness of her clothing, or the warmth of her own skin beneath the layers, but she accepted these sensations as part of her identity within a demanding world. This acceptance was strengthened by the absence of strict hygiene standards. The scientific understanding of bacteria and disease was still in its early stages, and households lacked the routines that later generations would adopt as common sense. Bathing infrequently did not signal neglect but practicality. Water was unreliable, heating it was laborious, and many doctors still warned against its frequent use. Women learned to maintain appearances through methods that concealed rather than eliminated odour. They brushed clothing, aired garments near windows, and relied on the circulation of outside air rather than cleansing the body itself. The subtle scents that rose from these layers remained unnoticed in a society where sensory overload from the urban environment dominated every street and home. In wealthier households, where perfumes and high-quality soaps were more readily available, scent became a marker of refinement, but not a universal expectation. Even these fragrances served more as adornments than as hygiene tools. Women dabbed floral waters onto handkerchiefs or applied scented oils sparingly, not to mask something shameful, but to embellish their presence. These gestures reflected custom rather than necessity. The underlying belief that ordinary human scent was natural persisted even among those who could afford to alter it. Because high-quality fragrances were expensive and labour-intensive to produce, their use remained limited to small touches rather than daily maintenance. They enhanced rather than redefined cleanliness. The physical realities of Victorian clothing deepened this tolerance. Layers of fabric wrapped the body so completely that scent became muted, enclosed beneath petticoats, stays, and skirts. The clothing itself absorbed odours, making them less noticeable and further delaying any perceived need for bathing. Women endured these layers day after day, knowing that no amount of washing could prevent garments from capturing the smells of the world around them. Because their clothing bore the same traces as their bodies, the distinction between clean and unclean grew blurred. Comfort, not purity, shaped their decisions. Communal life also shaped these norms. Homes were small, families were large, and privacy was limited. Women cooked over coal fires, scrubbed floors, and cared for children in rooms that held the aroma of meals, smoke, and damp clothing. In such spaces, scent belonged to the rhythm of domesticity. It reminded families of work accomplished and of the constant movement that defined their days. Efforts to eliminate bodily odour would have felt futile in environments where the air itself carried the smell of labour. As these patterns persisted, they formed a collective understanding. Victorian women did not feel alarmed when they sensed the natural odour of their own bodies. They felt no expectation to chase an ideal of cleanliness that did not exist in their world. Instead, they learned to navigate life through practical compromises. Scent became a background element, shaped by environment and necessity, accepted without criticism. In a society balancing on the thin line between survival and decorum, the natural scent of the body became not a flaw but a quiet acknowledgement of endurance. The acceptance of bodily odour reflected a daily life shaped by scarcity, practicality, and cultural norms that valued restraint over fragrance. Women learned to live within these limits, adapting their habits to a world that offered few alternatives. Beneath this acceptance lay another influence, one that complicated the very notion of staying clean. The bars of soap available to most Victorian families carried a roughness that began long before they touched the skin. Made from cheap fats and powerful alkalis, these coarse blocks lacked the softness and balance that later generations would expect from something meant for cleansing. In markets where goods were stacked without ceremony and scents blended into a dull haze, the soap sold to the poor appeared in dull shades of grey or yellow, its surface uneven and its edges crumbly. Women purchased these bars because they cost less than the refined versions displayed behind glass in wealthier districts, yet each use reminded them of the compromise they had been forced to make. When the soap met water, it produced a thin, sharp lather that bit at the skin rather than soothing it. Washing with it felt more like enduring a necessary discomfort than achieving a moment of relief. On hands already chapped from work, the soap left a burning sensation that lingered long after the water dried. It carried a harshness that crept into the small cracks along the knuckles and sank into the tender spaces between fingers. Women who attempted to wash their arms or faces with it felt the sting spread across the surface of their skin, leaving behind a tightness that made movement uncomfortable. Even when they tried to use it sparingly, the residue clung stubbornly to the body, its alkaline strength refusing to be rinsed away easily. The harshness of the soap was not simply an inconvenience, but an intrusion, one that turned the act of cleansing into an irritation that built upon the fatigue and strain of each day. The drying effect of these soaps transformed the simplest routines. After washing, the skin tightened, pulling at itself as if shrinking from the air. It became rough to the touch, sensitive to fabric, and prone to itching. Women felt this discomfort beneath their clothing, the layers rubbing against raw patches with every movement. Bathing, which should have restored some sense of comfort, instead amplified the sensation of irritation. A woman who washed her arms might spend the rest of the day feeling as though fine grains of sand clung to her skin. For those whose labour already involved exposure to cold, soot, or rough surfaces, the additional pain from the soap deepened the burden of daily life. Because the consequences were immediate, many women began to avoid using soap altogether unless necessary. They might wash their hands after a day's work, but avoid using soap on their faces, fearing the redness and burning that followed. Full bathing became even less appealing when it meant exposing larger portions of skin to the harshness of cheap soap. Parents hesitated before washing their children with it, aware that tender skin reacted even more severely. The discomfort of one bath often lingered for days, creating a cycle in which the memory of pain discouraged any attempt to cleanse again. Instead of encouraging hygiene, the soap available to the poor created a quiet resistance to it. The expense of gentler soaps meant that only wealthier households could experience washing as something comforting. These refined soaps, scented and carefully formulated, dissolved easily in water and left the skin smooth. For the poor, the contrast deepened the divide between classes. Cleanliness, already difficult because of limited water, became further stratified by access to materials that did not harm the body. Women in poorer homes adapted by using water alone or wiping themselves with damp cloths to avoid the sting of cheap soap. Bathing rituals that relied on soap became rare, reserved for moments when they had no alternative. In many neighbourhoods, the harshness of soap became a shared understanding among women who gathered at communal pump sites or wells. They compared experiences, showing reddened patches on their wrists or elbows as quiet testimony to the challenges of washing. There was no sense of shame in avoiding soap, only a resignation shaped by economic constraint. The knowledge passed from woman to woman, mother to daughter, creating habits rooted not in ignorance but in self-preservation. If a bar caused pain, it was reasonable to avoid it. Cleanliness needed to fit within the realities of their bodies and their resources, not the expectations promoted in medical texts or by wealthier households. The industrial processes used to create these cheap soaps further complicated matters. Factories prioritized quantity over quality, producing blocks filled with impurities that scraped rather than smoothed the skin. Workers had no control over the composition, and consumers had no means to determine what made each bar more or less irritating. Without regulation or transparency, the poor relied on whatever the market offered, accepting the consequences because they lacked alternatives. Even when rumours spread about better soap available elsewhere, the cost made such options irrelevant. Streets shaped their habits as much as biology did. As these patterns became entrenched, the discomfort associated with soap fused into the larger reluctance to bathe that defined Victorian life. Women who had endured the burning sensation once or twice learned to anticipate it and adjusted their routines accordingly. The idea of washing became tied to the idea of enduring unnecessary pain. In a world where daily survival already required tolerance for hardship, adding another source of discomfort felt unreasonable. Instead of bathing, women focused on managing appearance through clothing and small surface cleaning, practices that required less exposure to the sting of soap. Over time, the avoidance of bathing felt not like a flaw but like a practical response to the tools available. The harshness of cheap soap shaped not only hygiene, but also the emotional relationship women had with cleanliness. They understood that the materials meant to help them were the same materials that harmed them. Their avoidance was an act of self-protection, a way of preserving what little comfort their environment afforded. In this tension between desire and possibility, bathing receded from daily life and became an occasional necessity rather than a routine. The sting of cheap soap reinforced a world where washing felt like punishment instead of relief. The pain it caused shaped habits and hardened reluctance, leaving women with few reasons to endure the discomfort again. Pressures beyond physical irritation soon played their own role in pushing bathing even further from daily life. Winter in Victorian towns arrived with a severity that pressed itself into every corner of daily life, turning the simplest movements into negotiations with cold that never seemed to lift. Houses built from thin timber or aging brick held little warmth, and the air inside often felt no gentler than the air outside. Women woke each morning to rooms where their breath drifted visibly in front of them, a faint cloud signalling the chill that lay ahead. In such conditions, the idea of bathing did not resemble a refreshing ritual, but a confrontation with forces that could harm the body more quickly than dirt ever could. Water gathered from wells or pumps grew icy by the time it reached the basin, and even the act of pouring it sent a sting through the hands that carried it. Washing became an ordeal that began with endurance rather than intention. Cold water tightened the skin instantly, leaving behind a numbness that spread across the arms, chest, and back with alarming speed. Women who attempted to wash more than their hands felt the cold settle into their bones, stiffening muscles until movement became slow and heavy. The chill made breathing shallow, and the shock of it sent a tremor through the body before a woman could even begin to cleanse herself. Physicians of the era, already wary of frequent bathing, warned that such exposure invited illness. Their cautions echoed through neighborhoods where fever, cough, and weakness were common visitors. A single chill could become a persistent ailment, and mothers feared the possibility of turning a moment of washing into days or weeks of sickness. In homes where each member's strength contributed to survival, the risk felt far too large to ignore. The absence of reliable heating deepened these fears. Fires burned unevenly, consuming coal or wood faster than families could afford to replenish them. Women tended their stoves carefully, rationing fuel so that cooking and warmth competed for priority. A bath required heat not only for the water but for the room itself, and few families had enough resources to warm both. Even when the stove glowed red, its reach seldom extended beyond a small radius. A woman stepping away from that circle of warmth felt the cold grip her immediately. Rooms meant for washing transformed into pockets of icy air, their floors made colder by stone or packed earth that offered no insulation. Each contact with the ground sent another jolt upward through the feet and legs. Drafts slipped through cracks in window panes and beneath door frames, invisible but relentless. A cloth hung over a window did little to stop the intrusion. Women undressing for a bath felt these drafts swirl around them, sharpening the cold and making the exposure unbearable. The contrast between warm layers of clothing and the chill of undressed skin made the body recoil. Standing in that state of vulnerability, surrounded by cold that seeped into every surface, women sensed how quickly their strength could falter. Washing more than a few areas became an unnecessary gamble, one that could upset the fragile balance of health they worked so hard to maintain. These dangers stamped themselves into memory. Families recalled neighbours who had fallen ill after bathing during winter. Stories passed quietly from household to household. Whether these accounts were entirely accurate mattered less than the impression they left. The association between cold water and illness grew stronger each season, reinforced by personal experiences and the visible suffering of others. Women learned to equate warmth with survival and bathing with vulnerability. They made practical choices shaped by caution rather than neglect, and those choices became habits ingrained in the rhythm of winter life. Even attempts to warm the water carried their own challenges. A pot placed on the stove could heat only a small amount, and carrying it to the washing area allowed the chill to reclaim it almost immediately. Adding more water required additional fuel, more time, and more exposure to cold air. The process stretched into a sequence of actions that demanded physical endurance while offering little reward. By the time the bath was ready, the room was colder than before, and the water had lost its warmth before it could bring comfort. Women often abandoned the idea altogether, choosing instead to remain dressed and conserve their strength. Children added another layer of complexity. Mothers feared allowing them to bathe during winter, worried that their smaller bodies could not withstand the shock. Instead, they wiped faces and hands quickly, wrapping children in blankets as soon as the cloth left their skin. The avoidance of full bathing became an act of protection rather than neglect. In families where illness had already taken a toll, the decision felt even more justified. Women internalized these fears until winter bathing seemed not only uncomfortable but reckless. The relationship between cold and vulnerability shaped Victorian attitudes toward health. Warmth became a precious resource, conserved whenever possible. Clothing served as insulation not only against the weather, but against perceived threats to the body's defenses. Removing layers disrupted that protection. Bathing required abandoning the shield that clothing provided, and in winter, the loss of that barrier felt too dangerous to risk. Women approached the idea of washing with caution, shaped by instinct, memory, and necessity. The environment dictated their habits as forcefully as any societal expectation. As winter deepened each year, the reluctance to bathe solidified into certainty. The body's natural warmth felt fragile, a flame that needed shielding. Any practice that risked extinguishing that warmth seemed impractical. Bathing faded into the background of daily routines, replaced by surface cleaning and layers of fabric that hid the traces of daily labour. Women accepted these adjustments as part of surviving the season, making choices that balanced comfort, health, and practicality. The harsh winters turned bathing into a threat rather than a comfort, shaping decisions that prioritize survival over cleanliness. Cold rooms, icy water, and constant drafts made washing feel like a risk no one could justify. Within this atmosphere of fear and restraint, deeper concerns about privacy further discouraged the idea of bathing at all. Victorian society wrapped women in expectations that extended far beyond the fabric of their clothing, shaping not only how they behaved in public, but how they moved within the quiet corners of their own homes. Modesty governed the rhythm of daily life, rooted in a belief that the female body should remain concealed as completely as possible. A woman's worth was measured through restraint, silence, and careful control of how she occupied space. These expectations seeped into every aspect of personal care, turning the act of bathing into something weighted with caution and shame. Even in moments when a woman stood alone behind a closed door, the idea of removing her clothing carried an unease that echoed the voices of parents, peers, and preachers who had taught her to guard her body from exposure. Within cramped homes shared by families of multiple generations, privacy was not easily found. Doors lacked locks or swung loosely on hinges, offering little separation from the activity beyond them. A woman preparing to undress for even a partial wash listened carefully for footsteps in the hallway or voices approaching from other rooms. The simple act of loosening a corset felt daring in a world where showing an ankle could draw commentary. Removing layers of clothing, even when alone, carried an emotional burden formed not from vanity, but from a lifetime of being told that her body should remain hidden. Bathing demanded exposure, and exposure clashed with the values that shaped her identity. In wealthier homes, the architecture provided more space but not more freedom. Etiquette manuals instructed women to maintain modesty at all times, emphasizing the vulnerability associated with undress. A lady might have a designated dressing room, yet she still approached bathing with the same guardedness instilled since childhood. Servants assisted with dressing but rarely with bathing, as the latter required a level of intimacy considered inappropriate. Even married women hesitated to bathe while their husbands were nearby, aware that undressing for reasons unrelated to marital duty stepped beyond accepted norms. The bath became a concealed ritual, carried out quietly and without acknowledgement. Because bathing required such vulnerability, women learned to associate it with risk and discomfort. They chose times when households were calm or when other members were away, minimizing chances of interruption. Even then, the fear of being accidentally seen pressed into their thoughts, urging them to move quickly and avoid fully uncovering themselves unless necessary. Washing became a sequence of guarded motions, small areas of the body cleaned in isolation rather than through immersive ease. A basin of water replaced a tub, a cloth replaced immersion, and the ritual of bathing shrank in scale to protect a woman's sense of propriety. Cultural expectations deepened this hesitation. Religious teachings emphasized purity, but framed the body as a vessel prone to moral danger. Women were encouraged to treat physical form with suspicion, focusing instead on spiritual restraint. In this environment, bathing represented a moment when the physical demanded attention, disrupting the preferred narrative of invisibility. The body became undeniable when stripped of fabric, and this awareness unsettled women taught to minimize their presence. The act of bathing felt intimate in a way that conflicted with social ideals, and many women internalized this tension until avoidance seemed the simplest resolution. Stories whispered among women reinforced these attitudes. Incidents of accidental exposure, even within private homes, circulated with an air of caution. A door opening unexpectedly, a relative entering without knocking, a neighbor glimpsing through an uncurtained window. Each account carried the weight of embarrassment that lingered far longer than physical discomfort. These stories reminded women that privacy could be breached easily, and the anxiety of such moments overshadowed the practical need for bathing. Shame became a powerful deterrent, shaping habits more forcefully than water scarcity or cold rooms ever could. The architecture of Victorian homes offered little reassurance. Many houses lacked dedicated bathroom spaces, forcing women to wash in multi-purpose rooms such as kitchens or bedrooms. These areas, constantly in use, provided no sense of sanctuary. A woman bathing behind a makeshift screen or a hung blanket felt exposed even when unseen, aware that the barrier was symbolic rather than secure. She listened for the creak of floorboards, the rattle of a doorknob, and the rustle of fabric that signalled someone approaching. The thin divide between privacy and intrusion transformed bathing into an activity that demanded vigilance rather than relaxation. Even when physical privacy existed, internalized expectations persisted. Women felt obligated to maintain modest posture, even when alone, and avoided looking directly at their own bodies. The act of bathing forced them to confront themselves in a way that contradicted a cultural script designed to separate women from their physicality. This discomfort layered itself onto the practical challenges of bathing, creating an emotional barrier that grew stronger with each passing year. The less frequently women bathed, the more daunting the act became, reinforcing a cycle that redefined cleanliness through concealment rather than through washing. Within this framework, bathing shifted from a hygienic necessity to a morally charged act requiring careful timing and emotional preparation. Women learned to navigate their routines with caution, finding alternatives that allowed them to maintain modesty. Wiping small areas of the body or limiting washing to the face and hands aligned more comfortably with societal expectations. These practices preserved the illusion of propriety without risking the vulnerability associated with full undress. Over time, the idea of private bathing transformed from a personal choice into an act that felt transgressive, something to be hidden as much for emotional preservation as for reputation. The pressure to remain modest shaped bathing into an act shadowed by caution, turning privacy into a fragile resource that few women possessed. The emotional weight of exposure discouraged even the simplest forms of washing. Yet this reluctance grew stronger when another concern entered the household, one that challenged not only modesty but the very safety of the bathing space itself. Bathing in Victorian homes unfolded within spaces that offered far more uncertainty than comfort, shaped by architecture that had never been designed with privacy in mind. Rooms doubled and tripled in function, leaving little distinction between places for work, rest, and personal care. A woman preparing to wash might find herself standing in a corner of the kitchen, beside the stove where meals simmered, or in a bedroom shared with children who stirred unpredictably in their sleep. In many households, the area used for washing was no more than a narrow section of floor near a basin, exposed to drafts and footsteps. The physical environment carried a sense of vulnerability that settled heavily on any woman attempting to undress long enough to cleanse herself. She lived within walls that separated her from the outside world, yet offered little separation from the life unfolding within her own home. The absence of dedicated bathing rooms meant that spaces intended for bodily care blended uneasily with spaces intended for household tasks. Toilets, when present at all, sat near kitchens or bedrooms, sometimes within arm's reach of the only wash basin available. Moisture, odours, and noise drifted through these areas without restraint. A woman who knelt beside a small tub placed on the floor could easily hear someone approaching, but the warning did little to diminish the anxiety of being discovered mid-wash. Doors, lightweight and poorly fitted, rattled with every shift in the air. Their locks, when they existed, were flimsy metal latches that failed as often as they held. Even the sound of the latch sliding into place brought little reassurance, for a strong push or an accidental tug could render the barrier useless. Privacy became not a guarantee but a hope. In cramped tenements where families lived only a few feet apart, walls did little to block sound or movement. Children wandered freely. Relatives passed through rooms without knocking, and neighbours entered homes with a casual familiarity born of necessity. A woman attempting to bathe in such an environment learned to remain tense, her ears attuned to every creak of the floorboards. She washed quickly, not because of the cold or the limited water, but because of the looming possibility that someone might appear before she had time to conceal herself. The shame of being unexpectedly seen outweighed the discomfort of incomplete washing, and many women chose to avoid bathing altogether rather than endure the fear that accompanied it. Even in wealthier homes, where larger rooms and thicker doors offered some degree of separation, the sense of intrusion persisted. Servants moved